Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to lecture 2.3 on Melanie Banks on collective and individual responsibility for climate change. So I just actually recorded this whole lecture already, and then I was trying to figure out how to cut off the weird beginning and ending where I'm opening my software. And in doing that, I deleted the whole thing. So now I'm giving the lecture again. And for this reason, I have learned my lesson, and I'm afraid I will never try to do this editing again. And you will therefore have to always see the very strange beginning and ending. I'm sorry about that, but apparently my video editing skills are mostly destructive, so I'm not going to employ them anymore. Okay, so I think this is a really cool paper. I found it a little bit slippery, um, meaning there were some moves in the argument that I thought were a little hard to get a grip on. But I also think the paper has a really important idea, which is that because climate change is the result of collective action, all of our actions together, we need an account of collective responsibility if we want to have a good account of moral responsibility for climate change. So I think it's really worth thinking about this paper seriously, and um, I hope that you also found it interesting. All right, so we can break down the paper into two big aims. So Banks wants to show that we are individually responsible for the harm of climate change, even though the harm of climate change is caused by a collective. And she wants to say that we're a member of this collective if we knowingly contribute to climate change, but our degree of responsibility depends on our role in the collective and not on just how much pollution we emit. So we'll articulate this more precisely later on. Now, before we get going, we need to review a distinction between moral and causal responsibility. And this is a distinction that you have seen already in Senator Armstrong's discussion of individual responsibility last week. But the important point is that moral responsibility is not exactly the same thing as causal responsibility, even if there's an important connection between them. So, I'm going to give you a couple examples to make this clear, but the general point is that even if causal responsibility is necessary for moral responsibility, it's not sufficient for it. So what do I mean by this? Well, you've seen the distinction between necessary and sufficient conditions, so hopefully this is starting to make sense to you. But here's an example. Suppose somebody pushes me and I bump into you and you fall off the sidewalk and hurt yourself. This is you falling off the sidewalk. Now, in this case, I'm causally responsible for you falling off the sidewalk because I was a link in the causal chain. Somebody pushed me, I bumped into you, you fell off the sidewalk. But we would normally want to say that I'm not morally responsible for the harm done to you in this case, precisely because somebody else pushed me and I just bumped into you. I wasn't in control in that case. But now suppose that I intentionally push you off the sidewalk because I'm angry at you. This is me. I'm angry and I make this happen. In this case, it seems like we want to say that I am both causally and morally responsible for the harm done to you. After all, I intended to hurt you in this case. I would never really do that. Okay, so this is a distinction between moral and causal responsibility that will be important to Banks's arguments, and it's important especially because she agrees with many people that causal responsibility is required for moral responsibility, it's necessary, but she doesn't think that it's sufficient. So other things need to be in place in addition to being causally responsible for whatever the morally significant outcome is that we're concerned with. Now, the second primer we need to do here before we get going is a little primer on collective responsibility, just to orient ourselves to what we're talking about here. So suppose we have a bunch of people, and suppose that we just consider these people as a group. Now the question we want to ask is, can these people be responsible as a group? Can the collective of people be responsible? Now, we're not going to talk about all these debates, but there are a lot of interesting debates about collective responsibility in philosophy. So, a lot of people are interested in the question whether the conditions on collective responsibility are the same as the conditions on individual responsibility. So, as we saw before, it's intuitive to think that an individual has to do something intentionally to be responsible for it. When I was just pushed into you, even though I played a causal role in something bad happening to you, because I didn't intentionally shove you and said I was pushed, we want to say that I wasn't morally responsible. And so the question naturally arises whether, just as in the case of individuals, so too in the case of groups, does the group need to have the intention to do the action that it does, to be responsible for it? That's one question. Another question concerns just what kinds of groups can be responsible. So, can nations be responsible? Can teams be responsible? Can companies be responsible? Can any group whatsoever be responsible, or is it only certain kinds of groups? There are even more fundamental questions about how we should understand group action in the first place. So, we might think we have a kind of intuitive grasp on what it is for an individual to act. Do we even know what we're talking about when we talk about the action of a group? That's another set of questions we might want to explore. And and then we might want to ask questions about how collective responsibility relates to individual responsibility. And as we've seen, Banks takes herself to be taking a stand on this issue. She's saying that her account of collective responsibility is reductive, meaning that it also gives an account of individual responsibility in terms of the actions of the collective. So she thinks there's a close link between the responsibility of the collective and the responsibility of the individuals in it. Um, she, I think, does not say anything about this question, how we should understand group action in the first place. It's clearly an important question, but you can never answer every question in one paper. And so this is just not what her paper is about. Okay, so let's set up the problem in the way that Banks sets it up. So she begins with a principle which is called the polluter pays principle. And this principle says that whoever pollutes should bear the cost of cleanup, and the polluters should bear costs proportional to the amount that they pollute. Pardon the typo there. So this is a very intuitively appealing principle, but Banks thinks it doesn't work for collective harms. It's appealing because there are a lot of cases involving individual action where it does make sense to think that if I do something that causes some harm to somebody and I'm responsible for that, the recompense I owe that person, therefore the degree of my responsibility, is proportional to the magnitude of the harm I do to them. There might be other factors, but that seems to be a principle that motivates our thinking in many cases. And as Banks understands it, the reason this principle doesn't apply very well to the case of climate change is that in isolation, no individual activity is breaking the environment. So we can't trace the harms caused by individual actions in the right way to apply the polluter pays principle at all. And this was something that Walter Sinner Armstrong thought was a big deal. He thought that it was really important that we'd be able to trace individual actions to individual harms. But what Banks wants to say is that this fact that the polluter pays principle isn't well suited to collective responsibility and to the case of climate change doesn't show that we're not responsible for climate change. The lesson we should draw, she thinks, is that we need a different account of moral responsibility for climate change. We need an account of collective responsibility. Okay, so what I want to do is walk you through the basics of the model, and then we're going to talk about each of the elements in a little more detail. And there really are a lot of details in this paper that we can't fit into a lecture. So read the paper and go back and look at the parts that are relevant to what you're thinking about. in a little more detail after you watch this. Okay, so one question we need to ask whenever we're giving an account of collective responsibility according to Banks is the question of who is in the collective. Another question is which members of the collective are morally responsible. And a final question is how much responsibility those responsible members bear. So how responsible are the responsible members? So let us assume that we do have a polluting collective here, and now we're going to try to answer these three questions. So first, let's figure out who is in the collective. Now, Banks says that we answer this question by looking at who participates in the harmful collective action. We'll talk about this notion of participation in a moment. Let's assume for now that we have figured out who is participating in the harmful collective action, and it turns out it's these people. Okay, but just because these people are members of the collective that is causing harm, we don't yet have a guarantee that all of them are morally responsible for the harm that the collective is causing. So we need to find out which members of the collective are morally responsible. And here Banks wants to say that we have two conditions that need to be met. There's a causal condition, so to be morally responsible, these need to be agents who directly or indirectly cause the harm, and they're not doing so through coercion. So this causal condition needs to be met, but an epistemic condition also needs to be met. And as you've seen, an epistemic anything means something relating to knowledge. So the epistemic condition is that the agents must know the nature of their act, so they need to know what they're doing, or they have to not be excusably ignorant of what they're doing. So if you're excusably ignorant, if you shouldn't have known better, then you're off the hook. So let's assume that these ones outlined in orange, they are the responsible members of the collective. They meet these two conditions. Okay, we still have question 3. How much responsibility do these individual members bear? Well, according to Bank, this is going to depend on the individual's role in the collective. And she has a 3-tiered account of the degree of responsibility. This is also something we'll talk about in a little more detail. First, we have the order givers. These are the most responsible. Then we have the order followers. These are slightly less responsible for climate change. And then we have the supporters. These are the least responsible, but they are still responsible. So let's use the thickness of our outlines to determine, to represent these roles. So let's suppose that the order giver is this one, outlined in the widest line. Order followers are these two, outlined in a slightly less thick line, and then the supporters are the ones outlined in the very thin orange. Okay, so this represents their degree of responsibility. Let's look at these 3 elements in a little more detail, though. So we had said that you become, on Banks's account, you become a member of the collective causing climate change if you participate in this harmful collective action, which causes climate change. But we want to know, what does it mean to participate in the collective action? And here Banks says the following. She says there's a twofold way you could be a participant in the collective. One way you could be a participant is if you, and here I'm just quoting, if you reciprocally provide solidarity and receive identification from the collective. Another option, however, is that you causally contribute to the collective outcome and you're not participating in a recognized activity by combining action and language to publicly distance yourself from and denounce the actions of the collective. This sounds like a mouthful, but let me say a little bit more. So the first thing I want to say is that I take it Banks is focusing on the notion of an individual's participation because she wants to agree with the idea that we can't cause climate change as individuals acting alone. Given that climate change is the result of an action that is collective, no individual can cause climate change alone, it makes sense to think of what's relevant to our the relevant notion in understanding membership in the group is participation and not causal contribution. Okay. This first alternative, one way of getting membership in the collective is by being in a relationship of solidarity with the collective or identifying with it. And I'm going to ignore this notion for the most part, but I think her concern here is to allow for cases where somebody is genuinely participating in a culture which promotes the collective action that is causing the harmful effect, but they don't, in fact, as an individual, emit any greenhouse gases in this case. So I think in a footnote, she explains a little bit why she thinks there are kinds of cases, maybe not climate change, but other kinds of collective responsibility cases where you really need a condition like an account like this with this kind of a way of becoming a participating member to give a plausible account. We're not going to worry about that too much anymore. The set of conditions that's more relevant for us is that you become a member by causally contributing to the collective outcome and not distancing yourself through action and language. So the first thing, why should we think that you need to causally contribute to the collective outcome, which is climate change here, to be a member of the collective causing climate change? Well, I think she's motivated here by the idea that causal contribution is going to end up being relevant to moral responsibility. And it makes sense also to say that if you're making a causal contribution to a group action, you are participating in that action. The third thing here, this third point, this is an excusing condition. So here she wants to be able to say, because she thinks we ought to be able to say, that if you're causally contributing to climate change, but you denounce the harm and distance yourself from it, you're excused. Your participation is mitigated. So you might imagine a person who cannot help but make some causal contributions to climate change because, maybe they live in a society where you have to commute, and in order to make a living, you have to commute, and you cannot commute to work without making some causal contribution to the collective action that is producing climate change. She wants to allow for this kind of person who really dedicates themselves in many aspects of their life to denouncing climate change, to try to mitigate the effects, all sorts of things that they're devoting their time and energy to. This is supposed to be a excusing condition. I think this is supposed to recognize the fact that it's very hard to avoid causally contributing to the collective outcome at all. Okay, so let's look at the second question, which members are morally responsible? Here, the causal condition is pretty straightforward, though we should talk about the coercion bit. So when Banks says that you meet the causal condition if you cause the harm directly or indirectly, and you're not coerced into acting this way, she's trying to excuse somebody that is subject to genuine coercion. So suppose that somebody threatens to harm my family if I do not purchase and drive a gas guzzler. In this kind of a case, Banks wants to say that I'm coerced, and so I don't meet the causal condition. However, it's important to note that she doesn't understand coercion so broadly that the conditions of life that might make it a burden for me to avoid driving a gas guzzler, say, if there are such conditions, those kinds of things don't excuse me from responsibility for climate change. She's talking about genuine coercion. The epistemic condition is that you need to know the nature of your act. And here, she wants to recognize that for a long time, people simply didn't understand that climate change was happening, or they didn't understand what caused it. So she wants to say, if I don't know anything about climate change, and it's not because of sheer negligence that I don't know, I'm not responsible. So Banks thinks that a lot of people prior to the 1990 IPCC report, which really made public the problem of climate change, a lot of people prior to this time really didn't have the required knowledge to be morally responsible for climate change. However, she would say that nowadays there are probably still people who do not have the knowledge, but they really ought to know. And the reason they don't know is negligence. And so she doesn't want to excuse this kind of person. Okay, so question 3 is how responsible are the responsible members? And as we've seen, there are 3 levels of responsibility, so now we need to specify what this means. First, we have order givers, and these are the most responsible. An order giver would be, for example, a political leader of a country. These, according to Banks, are people who have the most responsibility because they have the most power to affect the collective actions, and they have the most perspective concerning the collective who is causing climate change. So political leaders have a lot of power over what collections of people do, and they also have a lot of knowledge and understanding of the situation of the entire collective. Next, we have order followers who are slightly less responsible. These would be, for example, CEOs of companies and small business owners. These people also have power and perspective, Banks thinks, but they don't have as much as order givers. And we can understand this by noting that a CEO of a company or a small business owner has power and perspective over a much smaller group. And last, we have the supporters, who are the least responsible members in the collective, and these are just ordinary citizens. So supporters have some power over the collective and some perspective. Assuming we're all just ordinary citizens, we all do have some power and some perspective concerning the collective causing climate change, but much less than order givers and also less than order followers. And this is why supporters are least responsible. Okay, so those are the main elements of Banks's account, and now I just want to ask 2 questions to you all to end. And I'm not going to try to answer these questions here. These are for you to think about, and in some ways they are relevant to the paper topics, the first paper. So do be thinking about these. We'll hopefully talk about them in the live Zoom class too. Okay, so consider this passage. And here I'm just going to be quoting Banks. She says, "One central critique of collective responsibility is that it holds agents responsible for that which is not within their control. This manifests as a claim that an agent, in the case of climate change, could only be responsible for their carbon emissions, either in their entirety or just those that were above their carbon share. It's their emissions that causally connect them to the group harm, their emissions that they can control, and thus it must be their emissions for which they are responsible. Such analysis, although initially plausible, fails to capture the nature of collective harms. By pulling apart collective responsibility from individual responsibility, the approach I'm proposing avoids this problem. The causal contribution of an agent, as determined by participation, is important for membership in the collective. Therefore, not being responsible is within the ability of the agent herself. If the agent distances themselves through action and language, if their action is coerced, if they, through no fault of their own, do not know the nature of their action, then they will not be responsible. However, agents who do meet the criteria are responsible. What they are responsible for, their level of culpability, depends on a different analysis, one that looks at collective harm as a collective harm. And here, the important characteristics of the agent are their power and perspective in a collective. Okay, so first I want to ask you a question about just what Banks's view is here. So according to Banks, is our level of responsibility within our control? What do you think of her view here? She definitely thinks it's important that agents be able to avoid responsibility. It's not, I think she thinks it's not fair to hold an agent responsible when it's not in their control whether or not they're responsible, they're responsible for that thing. But the further question I ask is, does Banks think it's also in our control how responsible we are? That's one question for you. A second question for you is this. Does Banks's account of individual responsibility for climate change strike you as fair? So the first question was about what Banks thinks, and now I want to ask you whether you think that her account of individual responsibility for climate change is fair. Let me read you two more passages, and then we'll end. So Banks, I'll note, thinks that it should strike you as fair. Here's what she says. Perhaps an agent lives in a remote and cold region, which would mean they use more fuel than those who live in warm climates. In these cases, agents emit the emissions that they do because of conditions that are outside of their control. In order to keep from holding agents responsible for such factors in their lives, and instead for their participation in the collective, I am emphasizing the social nature of collective action and keeping responsibility to elements of agents' lives over which they have control. The second relevant passage here, very short, Banks says, the determination of responsibility is based on power and perspective, not causal contribution. So this might be relevant, especially because Banks seems to acknowledge in this passage that we do not always have control over our causal contribution. If we live in a very warm climate, we will produce less carbon emissions than if we live in a very cold climate. That's not something that's in our control. As you've seen, however, there are a lot of other details of Banks's account, and some of those other elements we can also ask of them. Is she giving an account here that strikes you as fair? Okay, so I am going to end now on this note, and I look forward to discussing this paper with you all in the live class.